Hi, and welcome to Module 6 of Lecture 1. Here we're going to be a little more concrete than previously and discuss very specifically the relationship between theories and hypotheses. Remember, a theory here is any set of logically related symbols that represents what we think about the real world. So it's a set of interrelationships, causal relationships between various concepts that help explain one or more phenomenon that we see in the real world. A hypothesis, in contrast, is much more narrowly focused. It's a testable statement of a single relationship derived from some theory. It tells you how some independent variable or variables affects some dependent variable. The goal here of our scientific endeavor here, is to produce falsifiable testable hypotheses. That's sort of our theory building endeavor here, our theory building job. And to do that, the goal is to set up a null hypothesis that we can try to find evidence to reject. Remember from an earlier module, a null hypothesis is a hypothesis there's no relationship between the independent variable x and the dependent variable y. A null hypothesis is implied by every research hypothesis, because the research hypothesis is some change in x leads to a change in y, while the null is a change in x has no effect on change in y. Our goal is to attempt to find evidence to reject the null hypothesis, which if you do that, you are rejecting the hypothesis that there's no relationship between your independent and dependent variables, which provides support for any statement of a relationship between your independent and your dependent variables. We are not ever trying to find evidence directly to accept our research hypothesis. We're not trying to show that increasing x does increase y, for instance. We're trying to show that it is not true that increasing x has no effect on y. So that's sort of the goal here, to remind you from previous modules. So here's a concrete example of a very simple example, probably simple-minded in a whole lot of ways, but here it's easy to work through. The theory here, so the research question is, does a death penalty deter? Right? Many states have decided not to justify the horrific penalty and gotten rid of the death penalty. Other states have not. In understanding how these policies work, it's useful to sort of abstract away from one's response to the policy and to try to assess exactly what people are thinking it does, so we can make better arguments. So the theory underlying its continued existence in some states is that people consider the consequences of their actions before they're taking actions, and because the death penalty is so horrific, they will consider that ahead of time before they take any actions, and that will limit some of the worst actions they might take. Now, whether or not you believe with the theory in the slightest, we can derive hypotheses from it, and we can then test. So if that theory is true, one hypothesis that should follow from that theory is that the death penalty's existence should be an effective means of deterrence, right? And that follows from the assumptions in the theory, right? So if people consider the consequences of this, and you have this horrible consequence, right, of death, then you wouldn't do anything that might lead to that horrible consequence, in theory, and therefore you should be deterred from all sorts of activity, right? So that's a hypothesis. We can test that hypothesis, right? The research hypothesis here is the death penalty reduces crime because it deters crime, right, for the reasons stated. The null that we're testing is the death penalty has no effect on crime. So to test this, we set up a situation in which we try to see if we can reject the null hypothesis that the death penalty had no effect on crime. If we found that we could reject that null hypothesis, that there was a relationship between the death penalty's existence and crime reduction, then that would provide support for our theory. It would not prove our theory. There might be 1,000 other reasons why this relationship existed, but it provides support for the theory. In contrast, if we could not reject the null hypothesis here, then we would not provide support for the theory, and our belief in the theory's accuracy would be reduced. Okay. Let's go to a more elaborate one that can be a little clearer. Here we want to understand state education spending, and we don't want to understand why a state would, but we want to understand sort of why states differ in the amount of money they would spend on education. So we want to start off theoretically by beginning by identifying our actors and assumptions as before. The actors here are the state elected leaders that make educational spending decisions. Right? I said before, we want to go down, provide micro foundations, not discuss what states do as if states were just a thing that make decisions themselves. Rather, we want to identify what the individuals in each state who make decisions on education spending, what they want, how they're constrained. Okay. So those are the actors. The assumptions about them are a few. One, they value being reelected. That's been a common assumption we've been making so far. You see it all over the place in political science. Two, they want to maximize their chance of being reelected. Right? That sort of follows from one if you in a rational choice perspective, but doesn't have to follow if you're not using rational choice. We're not necessarily using rational choice here. Three, state elected leaders, in order to maximize their chance of being reelected, respond to the demands of their constituencies. So if individuals in the constituencies who vote for them say, we want more spending, or we want less spending, then this assumption says that the elected leaders will listen to that and try to go along with that. Okay, now that's not necessarily true, right? There are all sorts of arguments that would not be a good assumption. We're not going to go into them now, but the nice part about laying this out this way is if you don't believe that assumption, you can just say that up front, and you can have a reason for disbelieving the consequences. Okay, so more assumptions. The constituency can actually make these demands. Right? One reason you might not believe that assumption in the previous slide was that constituencies don't get together to make these, uniform demands about expenditures often. So we're going to assume they can do that. Maybe they do that individually. Maybe they elect someone locally to make these demands. Maybe they can solve their collective action problem and get together and make demands as a group. We don't know. We're assuming there's some way that they can get their demands to the elected officials. We're going to assume also that elected officials can't just increase spending indefinitely. They can't say, well, everyone wants more education spending, so let's make it $1 trillion right now. Increase it, because there's some limits on what they can spend, and these limits are the cost they encounter for increasing spending. This cost could be sort of the cost electorally to them of raising taxes, which makes people want to vote for you less. It could be the cost you get from having to take money out of other things you want to spend, you want to deliver money to. Regardless, we assume there's some cost, and we assume these costs for education expenditures are conditional on state policy factors and financial conditions. Okay? So, to be named later. Okay, so here's our theory. State education spending is a function of political demands and financial costs. We developed this theory deductively. We started with a whole bunch of assumptions, and we deduced, in this case very quickly, a theory from those assumptions. Primarily, we said the people in office want to be reelected. To do that, they have to satisfy the constituencies. That implies the spending they offer, right, because it affects constituencies' likelihood of reelecting them, right, will vary according to those political demands, but also to the costs they experience, which also can affect their chance of being elected more indirectly. So that's our theory. So again, we deduce the implications of our assumptions to derive the effect of those variables, those independent variables, on our dependent variable of education spending. Okay, now we start moving on to the measurement part of this. We'll discuss a whole lot more in part 2 of lecture 1. But we're going to have to identify which of the variables we're going to operationalize anyway. So what are we operationalizing? Well, first, our dependent variable, education spending. And then second, our two independent variables, political demands, that's x1, and financial costs, which is x2. Okay. To operationalize our dependent variable, we have to think carefully about what kind of spending really matters, right? At a first pass, we could just say total money spent in education as a whole. But this can include college and university spending, and we're not really thinking about that in terms of local constituent demands. Right? So let's cut out all that stuff and we say total money spent by the state on elementary and secondary education. But that's not controlling for per capita spending, right? You could have some states like California with many more students than smaller states like Rhode Island, and you're comparing apples to oranges, and it's not a super good comparison. So let's look at per capita spending then. So dollars expenditures on educational expenditures per pupil in elementary and secondary education across the states. So now we've controlled for the size of the states effectively. But different states might have different administrative costs, and administrative costs don't tend to go directly to the students. So let's end by removing the administration expenditures and looking only at the net of those expenditures per pupil on instruction in elementary and secondary education across the states. Okay. So this will give you a sense of what you should do to operationalize your concepts, right? So the concept is state spending on education, but to measure it requires a little more thought and a little more care. But going back to the earlier modules, having a firm idea in our heads about what we meant by state education spending helps us narrow down our measures of state education spending. We don't include things like administration or higher education because that wasn't part of our theory. That wasn't part of our concept of education spending. Okay. For independent variables, we'll use really, really rough proxies for things. For political demands, operating on the assumption that Democratic voters tend to want higher levels of education spending than Republican voters, we'll use a proxy for political demands as the percentage of congressional delegation that's Democratic, with the idea being the higher that percentage, the higher the demands on the elected official to increase education spending. For financial costs, we'll look at state wealth as measured by per capita income. So higher incomes means less cost overall for enacting these things. Okay, so we can create hypotheses. As political demands increase, state spending in education will increase. So you know the first hypothesis, right, is only about how one independent variable affects our dependent variable. It's not both at the same time. We call it H1 because it's our first hypothesis. Our operationalized version of that is, as the congressional delegation becomes more democratic, state spending in education will increase. So as political demands increase, as measured by the percent Democratic, you get more spending in education. H2 is, as financial costs decrease, spending in education will increase. So wealthier states suffering lower costs will spend more on education. Those are our research hypotheses, and we have two of them. For each one, there's an associated null hypothesis. In the first case, and just take a moment to think about it for yourself, what they are, so I'll pause for a second. In the first case, the null is that there is no relationship between the percent Democratic of the state's congressional delegation and state spending in education. In the second case, there is no relationship between the wealth of the state and how much it spends in education. Okay, and then we're not going to actually do that here because we haven't learned how to do any of that stuff yet, but we can get a sense how it works by looking at a picture, which is also helpful to look at your data. This is from 1998, looking at state expenditures across the states, per capita, per pupil, net of administration costs. And you can sort of see how different states on average spend. And if you know something about how the states vary in terms of wealth and in terms of percent Democratic congressional delegation, you can get a sense of whether or not our theory is actually accurate. It looks like it's a mixed bag. It might be, but it's unclear in all cases. But anyway, this is how you go about developing these theories. And to evaluate the theory, we would take each hypothesis separately and then try to see if we can reject the null hypothesis. So in the first case, if spending significantly increased as political demands increased, we would reject the null that political demands have no effect on state spending. For the second hypothesis, if spending significantly decreased as costs increased, we reject the null that the wealth of a state has no effect on state spending in education. That's it. For most of the rest of this course, we're going to be talking about measurement and then just figuring out different ways to use our data to evaluate and test our hypotheses. Thanks.